Welcome to DroneCast, Rethinking Public Safety One Drone at a Time, a podcast by DroneSense. We explore real-world applications of drones in emergency response, offering a close examination of evolving trends in drone technology and its impact on public safety. I'm your host, John McLeod, Director of Customer Success here at DroneSense. Hello, and welcome to DroneCast. I'm your host, John McLeod. Today, we're kicking off an incredible episode with Chief Michael Lighthiser, who brings a wealth of experience and insight to the table. As Deputy Chief of Police at George Mason University since 2018, Chief Lighthiser has been at the forefront of GMU's public safety drone program, overseeing its development and application in a variety of use cases. From large-scale events like the Marine Corps Marathon to advanced interagency cooperation, Chief Lighthiser has seen it all. In our discussion, Chief Lighthiser shares his journey into drone technology, the invaluable lessons learned from real-world applications, and the unique ways in which drones are enhancing public safety at GMU. We also touch on the critical role of collaboration across agencies and the evolving challenges of operating within complex airspace. Let's get started. Welcome, Chief. It's great to speak with you today.
Thanks, John. I appreciate the intro and the invitation to come speak.
Thank you for being here. Jumping into it, with something like drones, it seems like everyone who works in our space has come into this technology kind of in their own kind of unique way to them, whether it's interest in aviation, just general tech enthusiasm, or maybe something entirely different. How did you find your way into being interested in drone technology?
I really didn't have much interest in it at all until the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in the summer of 2019. The famous video that we've all seen of the unfortunate events that led to Heather Heyer's death and a bunch of other injuries in Charlottesville, Virginia, which is about an hour and a half, 2 hours from us, was taken by a drone, a civilian drone, not law enforcement. But we saw that video in real time. I was actually working that day and can remember it very clearly. And our chief came to us and said, we need to find out what that technology is, and we need to use it for our purposes. Being in the D.C. national capital area, we have a lot of outdoor events across the region and large gatherings of people. And back at that time, the vehicle-borne attack was the biggest risk that was out there and really still is. We started looking into it, and in 2020, we had our first class. We had 10 people get their 107, and then we've been off to the races since then. Another unfortunate takeaway of the Unite the Right rally is Virginia State Police lost a helicopter that day, and 2 troopers were unfortunately killed in the crash. And that helicopter was providing overwatch, just a video downlink to the people on the ground. And since then, we've come to realize that the drone can do that just the same, and I would argue safer, because there's not 2 troopers on board and much lower cost. So that's kind of how we got into the drone game. We definitely had our coming out party, I guess you'd say, after the murder of George Floyd and the civil unrest that we had in the region. In one of our neighboring counties, there was a protest that sent a couple officers to the hospital after being hit with some bricks and cinder blocks and whatnot. And I got a call from my counterpart in that jurisdiction, and they said, hey, we hear you have these flying robots. Would those be helpful for us? And I said, sure, why not? So we went out, we flew for 7 straight days after that. And I can't say unequivocally that A equals B, but since we started flying, there were no other police officer injuries. So we had a lot of lessons learned from that, and we're off to the races from there. The region saw the utility of drones at that point, and the stream was shared through DroneSense. As a matter of fact, that was our first big DroneSense deployment. Thousands of people in the national capital region were watching that. It was being shared in Maryland's Unified Command, DC's Unified Command, Virginia's Unified Command, down at Richmond at the governor's office. So everyone was seeing that feed, and that was a big aha moment for the region for drone use, I would say.
That's really interesting. You've been with GMU for more than a minute now. And when I think we talk about drones and law enforcement, often kind of state and municipal partners get a larger percentage of that conversation, but there is really good and important work being done in law enforcement educational communities. This is particularly of interest to me with sending a kid to college. And I don't know if you guys necessarily get the share of the spotlight that you deserve with the work that you're doing. So I was curious if you could share with us a little bit about your mission and portfolio and how you use the technology to increase safety in your educational community.
Sure. So when our chief came, he had a big goal of leveraging the law enforcement side of the house as well as the educational side of the house. George Mason University is located about 20 minutes outside of D.C. in Fairfax, Virginia, and it's the largest public institution of higher education in the Commonwealth of Virginia. We have an undergraduate enrollment of just above 40,000 and a large research component. His thought was, why don't we leverage the really smart people to help those of us in public safety who sometimes aren't the brightest bulbs in the box, and let those smart people help us with the problems that we have. Because what we found is that those researchers were really eager for real world problems to look into as opposed to philosophical ideas that they're working on. So the real world problems they really enjoyed and the students enjoyed because there was also an immediate return on investment. They could ask us, hey, how did this work? And they'd actually see it, or they could come out and see it in the field themselves. That's the pairing that we had between the educational side and the law enforcement drone side. And we've flown on the public safety side, pretty much every public safety mission you can think, from fugitives to wanted subjects who have fled, fires, search and rescue, all the standard public safety stuff. But we've also helped on a bunch of research stuff. One of the projects we currently are doing is that we have a forensic research laboratory, or as most people would know it, a body farm, where we have human cadavers that have been donated and they're buried or left on top of the ground in this controlled area. And for the study of forensics, whether it be decomp or scatter from bones, whatever that may be. And we're running a project involving various sensors, LiDAR, and different camera sensors to see how that decomp is picked up with the drone, but also, more importantly, clandestine graves. When people go missing or if they're killed and buried in a makeshift grave, how can the UAS help to find that clandestine grave? Maybe not find the grave exactly, but if we can take 500 acres and narrow it down to 100 acres, that's much more manageable for boots on the ground or dog teams, whatever the case may be. So we've definitely been able to leverage that educational component as well as the public safety component on numerous projects. And it also helps develop the next generation of, I don't want to say drone enthusiasts, but technology folks that are going to be developing the next wave of technology for public safety. So these kids who are graduating 21, 22 years of age are entering the workforce. And maybe this is what ignites them to join a company like DroneSense as a developer, or join another American company that can help push the drone field forward. I think that's an important component, and hands-on is definitely the best way to get folks into the field, I think.
That's really fascinating. I didn't know you guys were doing all that. That's super cool. Perhaps out of your presence, but I hear the name of your agency and your name come up in a lot of different circles with a fair amount of high respect in terms of what you guys do, especially with the resources that you have available to you, which is wonderful. And one of the things that often comes up is that you guys are just awesome at Overwatch in particular. And often in public safety, that's some of the first disciplines that people use drones that we see over and over. And we've seen over the last few years a confluence of events and drivers, like you mentioned, political protests during the pandemic, major sporting events like the Super Bowl with some of our customers down in the Glendale area. More and more people are doing complex Overwatch. And Overwatch is special and unique depending on the scale and the geography that you're working with. I know that's a big question, but what have you learned doing Overwatch about doing it well, doing it successfully, creating value? What advice would you give agencies who are kind of getting their heads around that?
When we started doing Overwatch, it's the standard: deploy a drone, watch it, what's going on. When you run out of battery, come land and put a new battery in and go back up and do your thing. We evolved from there to using 2 aircraft at differing altitudes, having an air boss to make sure that everyone is safe and there's not going to be any mid-air collisions. And from there, I guess our biggest takeaway is planning is the key, right? Planning and training so that it's second nature. So in the field, you don't run into that issue. And last October, we did Overwatch with Arlington County and a bunch of other agencies for Marine Corps Marathon, at which time we operated 5 separate teams in the same area to cover a large area in Arlington County while the Marine Corps Marathon was going on. We were able to integrate those teams seamlessly so that all of the teams were operating together through one mission, one common operating picture. And that was, I want to say, by the end of the day, probably 10 different agencies that were participating. And those agencies were divided and working integrated with 3 or 4 agencies per team. And then all those videos were piped back to the main command post and shared. Prior to doing that, we had several trainings and meetings where we talked about this is how it's going to operate. We had an entire training day where we literally just put a drone up and brought a drone back, put a drone up, brought a drone back, so that we had a clear idea of how to operate and not collide with each other and just keep a good eye. And then from there, we were even not true drone as a first responder, but somewhat being dispatched to calls as we were doing Overwatch to check out injured runners, suspicious packages. We actually even had a car come on the race course that shouldn't have been there. So the drone was able to get over there, take an eye on what's going on, pipe that video back to not only the command post, but also units that were in response. So all of our tactical guys had access to it. They were running IMSAT so we could see where they were on top of the map so that we could direct them in if necessary, or what often was the case, tell them that they could disregard and go back to their location because the injured runner, for instance, wasn't actually injured. They just had to tie their shoe. So we were able to see that and get people back in action and not have to wade through the sea of humanity to get to something that was going to end up being nothing. So super helpful. We recently entered the fixed wing game on Overwatch, which has been a game changer. We acquired E400 from Event 38 out of Ohio and actually worked closely with DroneSense and the integration of that. We're flying an Israeli sensor, and that was, to my knowledge, the first time we've integrated that aircraft into the DroneSense platform. And it was definitely some heavy work, some heavy lift on both sides, both the aircraft manufacturer as well as the DroneSense side. But it has definitely changed the game as far as what we can do. So we can stay on site for 2 hours now. And also the way that Overwatch is used, right? So we're used to a quad where you just sit there and watch. This is a plane. It flies. It can't just sit still. It has to fly. So kind of relearning how you do things as far as figure eights, race tracking, that type of stuff to keep the camera on what we're looking for. We're fortunate enough in the Next Vision sensor we're using is a 360 gimbal, so it can spin completely around on its axis. So we can essentially racetrack offsite and keep the camera on the target as we're flying. And ironically enough, we learned these little tricks from one of DroneSense's own, former FBI pilot Ryan Bracken, who did it for a living in a manned aircraft. So Ryan definitely gave us some tips and tricks as far as using an airplane for Overwatch. So it's definitely been a development, and I think it's probably the easiest and best thing to learn because once an agency on the command side as well as boots on the ground have the ability to see the total picture, you're never going to go back. Gone are the days of playing telephone on the radio where 4 people are relaying stuff on the radio to somebody and you're making a decision based on that. That's no more. You can see it in real time. And during the protests for George Floyd, we saw that. And that was a huge, huge change because you can make decisions in real time as opposed to having to wait for the information to be relayed to you. So it's definitely something that I think is beneficial for any public safety entity, not just police, fire as well. We've had some pretty good use cases of using it for fire over Overwatch as far as like on the, here we call it the Charlie side, the back of the building, so that you don't have to put a guy out there. We had fire departments that were going around with cell phones and FaceTiming the battalion chief so that they could see what's going on the backside. Now they can see what's going on from the air as well as thermal. So we can see hotspots on the roof, direct people in from that. And also, more importantly, warn firefighters where there's hotspots to make sure they don't fall through the roof or anything like that. So super beneficial, and it's ever-evolving process.
For sure. I've heard you talk about some of the missions you guys have worked on, and you guys are incredibly modest when you describe what are invariably very complex missions with multiple agencies, lots of personalities, sometimes competing agendas, different kind of institutional frameworks, and where cooperation, communication, collaboration are really, really key to being successful. It takes a lot of acumen and patience and humility to kind of navigate those environments. It's in addition to understanding the technology and compliance and regulations, you got to manage people. And you guys seem to do that particularly well. And I was curious what you've learned about collaborating with other agencies and navigating sometimes those complex relationships along the way.
Yeah, so anytime we just got back from Southwest Virginia last week, we were doing a 2-day 107 prep class and then a 3-day intro to operations class down in Southwest Virginia. And anytime I have the ability to tell anyone, hey, we're thinking about starting a team, what should we do? I'm a very firm believer in a holistic public safety approach to the use of drones, that being a team that includes fire, police, emergency management. We have dispatchers on our team who work for the police department. So what we have found is that the more people you bring in, the more expertise you bring in, and that's just going to make you more successful. That being said, I have to teach the fire department what the police are looking for. And conversely, the fire department has to teach the police what they're looking for, because in my mind, the firefighter's job is to spray water on fire. Apparently, it's more complex than that, I'm told. So you got to learn the skills that they're looking for so that you can help them out. And likewise, they have to learn the skills that we're looking for so that they can help us out. We're also super fortunate, and not to toot our own horn, but I feel like we work in a region that is probably the most collaborative and supportive region in the United States, in the National Capital Region, specifically in Northern Virginia. The agencies work together seamlessly. We have a very common operating procedure and very much you'll be able to integrate different agencies together very quickly. We have a working group that meets quarterly, and we spend 2 hours hashing out drone stuff. We have 3 sub-working groups within there that include the FAA, new technology, and then different topics that we want to work on and think about as the team. So it gives us the opportunity for people to give successes as well as things that probably could have gone differently and could have gone better. So we don't want to replicate mistakes, right? If John has a mistake and he tells me about it, cool, I'm not going to make that same mistake, hopefully, if I'm humble enough to listen to what he says and not think that I'm the end all be all. That's worked well for us. Our agency is small. We're just over 40 officers, and my neighbors across the street, Fairfax County, is the largest agency in Virginia with 1,500 sworn. We work together well. We share each other's thoughts and we treat each other as equals, which I think is incredibly important as far as the ability to listen and learn from each other. Just because you're the small guy doesn't mean you have the best way to do it. And just because you're the big guy doesn't mean you have the best way to do it. I'm sure we have some things that they like. They have some things that we like. And why don't we incorporate those to make the biggest success? I tell people all the time, if you go to a training and you think 98% of the stuff was crap, well, guess what? You just learned 2%. So that's 2% more than you had when you got there. Even if you think the majority of it was junk, you still took something away from it. So that's very much the approach that we have, and it's served us well. We worked a 36-hour-long vehicle barricade with Fairfax County seamlessly. They did 8 hours. We did 8 hours. They came back, did 8 hours. We came back and did 8 hours. And what we heard from the follow-up is that there really wasn't any drop-off. They didn't know who was flying because there was that much continuity between the teams that the only way they knew what agency it was is by what identifier was being used on the radio. So that's really the goal, is to have a seamless transition to where you don't know that there's a difference because the level of quality that you're getting is the same across the board.
One of the things I've heard you and Ryan actually talk about at different times is you operate in a very complex airspace in the vicinity of the nation's capital, which makes a lot of sense in a post 9/11 world. Certainly wasn't the world I grew up in, but it's where we are today. Where we live in Austin, Texas, I'm about 2 miles from our big park in the center of town. And President Biden was here yesterday. So we got a little bit of taste of closing the airspace in the presence of a national VIP. Today, with him gone, I could pop a Mavic 3 up and fly it over to the park, and it wouldn't be a problem at all. However, I don't think that's probably the reality of the world you live on a day-to-day basis as well, too. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about kind of the airspace and how that affects your operations.
Yeah, so post 9/11, the flight restricted zone, the freeze, the frizz, whatever you want to call it, FRZ, was put in place, and it's roughly 15 nautical miles from the U.S. Capitol and around. So for us, that encompasses, lucky for us, probably 2/3 of our campus, and the other 1/3 is out of the freeze. So it's super beneficial for us because we still have 1/3 where we can go train at any time and not have to worry about waivers, this and that. The rest of it from where we are into D.C., so all of Arlington County, a large chunk of Fairfax, Alexandria, all these jurisdictions have to deal with the freeze, which is a no-drone zone, essentially. And we have to get around that with waivers. So it creates a very strong relationship with the folks at the FAA and the TSA who we have to talk to get our waivers. And as a result, we've troubleshot it to the point where it's seamless for us to fly in the freeze. We know the hoops that have to be jumped through, so we jump through said hoops and put in for the waivers, or if necessary, the emergency waivers to fly for specific missions. And honestly, we've gotten it down to the point where it doesn't really even slow us down. On our way to a call, we'll make the necessary calls. By the time we arrive on the scene, usually we have the blessing to fly. That gets a little more complicated when we get inside 7 nautical miles, because then we actually have to have a police officer of that jurisdiction with us to wrestle the controller away if we do something illegal, since the general patrol officer knows all of the drone regulations and can do that. So for the jurisdictions who operate in the freeze regularly, like Arlington, their pilot can have a guy with him who's an Arlington County cop, and they're checked. But for us, it has to be an officer who has jurisdiction in that area. So we would have to have, let's say, for instance, a cop from Alexandria come stand with us to make sure that we're within regulation, which is fine. And we've troubleshot that. Most of the agencies know that, and that's how we operate. For pre-planned stuff, we set all that up ahead of time. We get our waivers in place. We call and let them know. And then every 2 hours, we call back and let them know we're still flying. And then when we're done, we call them and sit them, tell them we're done. For the Marine Corps Marathon and some other events, we actually sat down and met with the FAA. We met with the tower at National and actually got a tour of the tower, got to go up and see them as they're landing planes and met face to face, shook hands. And after that, it was smooth sailing. And ironically enough, there had been a U.S. Marshal shooting in the city of Alexandria the day before we went and had the tour. And we went up to the tower, they introduced themselves. And one of our guys, who's the pilot who called in the waiver for that shooting scene, the person who granted that waiver was in the tower that he talked to. And so they got to meet face to face. And it was full circle. They're always just a voice on the phone to both sides. And they're like, it's really cool to actually see who it was and meet them. And that's really, really helped us to have a firsthand experience with people where you're a real person. You're not just a voice on the phone. So that's helped us big time in the airspace and waiver side of the house.
And that wraps up our first part of our conversation with Chief Lighthiser and our discussion on the transformative role of drones in public safety and the innovative approaches being implemented at George Mason University. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll continue our conversation with Chief Lighthiser, delving deeper into the technical and operational aspects of their drone program and exploring more of his expert insights on managing complex drone operations and interagency collaboration. Thank you for tuning into DroneCast. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like and subscribe and leave us a review. See you next time. DroneCast, Rethinking Public Safety one drone at a time, is brought to you by DroneSense. To find out more about DroneSense and how our comprehensive situational awareness platform can help you fly, share, and manage your drone program, please visit DroneSense.com. That's DroneSense.com. And then make sure to search for DroneCast in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or anywhere else that podcasts are found. Please don't forget to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at DroneSense, thanks for listening.